It's no surprise that I have a huge love and appreciation of Silent Hill 1. Upon subsequent videos that I made previously on the subject, we have seen topics that delve heavily into the development when it comes to uncovering its prototypes, cancelled and lost media, various adaptations, obscurities, and so much more information that highlights its relevancy, even 20 years later. It's an understatement to say the least that Silent Hill 1 is not only an important video game that laid the foundation for the series' formula, but revolutionized survival horror, that is seen to this day as the blueprint for laying the groundwork seen in other survival horror games. I would say that Silent Hill 1 is one of those games that is important in terms of influence in survival horror history, but also when it comes to people who grew up with this game in particular, that is of equal importance and value in a heartfelt and meaningful way. The same notion is also applied to me as well, as previously mentioned, how much I've spent time researching and documenting the miscellaneous topics of interest that I find utterly fascinating, which made me gain an appreciation for this specific game that slowly became my favorite Silent Hill game of all time, which is what brings me in wanting to talk about Silent Hill 1 Remake. It's no doubt that, subjectively speaking, that Silent Hill 1 Remake is a topic of interest, much like the former Silent Hill 2 Remake. When it came to the initial anticipation, with much thought-provoking speculation and discussion fueling interest in how this would perform as not only a remake, but whether this would complement the original, by adding onto it with quality life improvements, adopting modern mechanics that make it accessible for players that are new, but enough to give incentive to older players without feeling counterintuitive, and most importantly, paying tribute to the original source material by respecting the original team's vision, by adapting the original work to a modern audience with attributing that notion with not only reimagining this in a modern lens, but also complementing the work with giving new additions that adds on to the original, which gives it merit without changing too much where it loses its quality. Regardless of one's opinion on remakes, at the end of the day, the debate between the original versus the remake is subjective, and is a discussion that is for when the remake does eventually release, which is where we'll give a better idea of what to expect and have a preconceived understanding with time and experience once that's bestowed to us. Rather, I want to talk about how we can repurpose the remake to the best quality it can live up to be when it comes to reimagining the original Silent Hill and giving it that polish it needs, without losing foresight of the original's qualities seen in its gameplay fundamentals, subtle details that express methodical storytelling, and the artist's vision that is portrayed through the limitations seen in the original hardware at the time. This is a game that means a lot to me, so I hope in evaluating and discussing the means of creating a hypothetical Silent Hill 1 remake can be a worthwhile conversation that is productive, but also gives some insight into ideas Bloober Team could consider when it comes to approaching the remake. First and foremost, I think a question that may be overexhausted at this point by many is, why does Silent Hill 1 need a remake? It's not unheard of, nor unseen that remakes are very predominant in the video game industry nowadays. It's a topic of interest that is not only cemented in video game culture, but various mediums that can be seen in movies, shows, or books. In concept, a remake of an original work can be seen as beneficial, an improvement even, when it comes to incorporating such ideas as new technologies, enhancements, and techniques that had not existed or been commonly used when the original work was created. The same notion is applied to video games, such as the aforementioned Silent Hill 2 Remake, a modern retelling of the original that expresses new ideas portrayed through a modern lens while retaining that original quality, without disparaging the creator's work by losing focus on what made it special. Subjectively speaking, I don't believe Bloober Team went about losing that vision, nor disrespected the work Team Silent did back then, when it came to remaking Silent Hill 2. If anything, they expressed passion and excitement when it came to recreating the original in interviews, such as the developer's commentary and the initial build-up to the remake's release. In an interview with the website The Gamer, Bloober Team comments on the trials and tribulations on remaking a cult classic that brings about excitement and being bestowed the honor of readapting the original by the original team's blessing, but also self-aware enough to know that there will be skeptics and criticism that come with backlash, as it can bring about a negative connotation when adapting the original. Barbara Chuk, a senior narrative designer at Bloober Team, comments on the remake with, I quote, "Remaking a cult classic is inherently risky, especially 20 years after the initial release," she says. As a developer, you had to manage the expectations of fans who played the game when it was first released and match their memories, the expectations of those who played it more recently, and the expectations of those who never played the game, but became interested in it and its story through cultural osmosis. This was absolutely a divisive and controversial topic of interest when debating the initial anticipation of Silent Hill 2 Remake until its eventual release. Needless to say, it's one thing to make promises, but it's another in attesting to those promises that you can or cannot keep. And while it's easy to write off the remake and use the argument, just play the original, it's much more complicated than that, and not as simple. The Silent Hill series is very notorious for the lack of preservation of the original games that cannot be played nor accessed on modern platforms. If they are, this is through either official storefronts but spread out individually without having a primary storefront in particular and accessing all of them, or through unofficial ports that restore the original ports through restoration and faithfully preserving the original, while improving upon the issues of quality life improvements, starting from scratch. By no means these are bad options, nor am I implying that this is something I'm disparaging. If anything, I want to express how inconsistent it is to go about acquiring the originals through loopholes and needing a comprehensive guide to ensure that experience. Recently, I made a video on the Silent Hill decompilation project, which goes into detail over the long-term effort and tireless demand of undergoing the overwhelming process of rewriting a source code from scratch in order to allow developers to access and rework the source code into a solid foundation to allow for an unofficial port that is open source for either developers, modders, or players to access. It's likely why not only Silent Hill 1, but the original Silent Hill games haven't had proper preservation onto modern hardware, due to the archaic infrastructure of obsolete technology it originates from that needs a solid understanding from developers who know and can work with porting that technology onto a different platform. Ultimately, it comes down to Konami wanting to have interests and calling for a team of developers experienced in that field of study to go about preserving the original games and porting them, allowing them to be accessible on official storefronts. Ironically, this was a notion that was expressed by Konami back in 2022 when they appointed Hexadrive, the developers of Silent Hill: The Short Message, to originally remaster the Silent Hill games and port them onto modern hardware. However, this was dismissed by Hexadrive and instead repurposed into the spin-off Silent Hill: The Short Message. The point I'm making here is that while the remake of Silent Hill 1 does feel counterproductive, considering that the original is there to be experienced, and objectively speaking, should be experienced by anyone who wants to get into Silent Hill, is something that is unfortunately inaccessible and therefore needed to be experienced through other conventional means, such as a remake. Personally, I don't mind the idea of a remake, but I also acknowledge the implications that could derive, as it's easy to have bias and fall into the crowd of mindlessly clapping for the wrong reasons over something that has little to no understanding on my part, because I'm a Silent Hill fan and it has the Silent Hill label on said product that appoints me in consuming without having nuance and giving my opinion. I think it's my responsibility to be self-aware enough that there could be cognitive dissonance between sheepishly consuming a product with rose-tinted glasses, where it clouds my judgment from seeing the flaws and issues this remake could have that could be disregarded without having constructive criticism. However, I don't want to shamelessly give negative thoughts by deconstructing it with a pessimistic demeanor, but if anything, wishing to see improvements to give it merit for having longevity to its quality out of passion and care on my part. Whether or not the morality behind a remake is a good or bad thing is up to the player's experience and perception of the original and how that is translated to the remake. That is left for them to decide whether it's worthwhile or not. But regardless, a remake for Silent Hill, quite possibly, is the only means of experiencing said original to a certain degree, but through a modern lens that retains that original quality. For this section, I want to distinguish and categorize 4 fundamental components that are incorporated into facilitating the foundation that is Silent Hill 1. Gameplay, presentation, sound, and story. These are, in my humble and honest opinion, the root that plants the seeds for much of the experience you'll find when playing through the perspective of Harry Mason, the protagonist of Silent Hill 1. Harry is not only seen as the protagonist that reinforces the plot to move forward when it comes to having to save Cheryl, his adoptive daughter in Silent Hill, but also can be seen as a self-insert for the player to see what he sees. With this in mind, when you are left at his disposal once assuming control over him when it comes to gameplay, it's very slow, as it allows for the player to gain familiarity with the tank controls, such as movement, combat, or exploration. Surprisingly, Silent Hill has a lot of versatility to its overall gameplay fundamentals that are quite the contrast to earlier survival horror games, such as Resident Evil or Alone in the Dark. While tank controls assume the more clunky and rigid movement cycle that is to be expected, the game takes this and builds upon this of giving Harry more flexibility with his overall momentum. Harry, while he can go in the typical forward, left, right, and backward motion, he can also move simultaneously by sprinting to his left or right side or hop backwards. While a small departure to what we are normally accustomed to, it's a flexible nature of using his movement to his disposal when engaging in combat that could be in his favor, such as avoiding numerous enemies in linear hallways that are too overwhelming to handle, which sees Harry need to retreat to a safer area. Movement doesn't have to pertain to just enemy encounters, but also navigating throughout Silent Hill. The purpose of this momentum is of course to give options for the player when it comes to exploration, but it also gives a sense of nuance that wasn't seen in many survival horror games back then. This is something I'd like to see expanded upon in the remake, as I feel like the same notion could be applied there. Of course, because it's a remake, there is a common sense that due to the more advanced technical hardware, that movement allows for more variety on a 3D playing field. But what I mean by this is that I like to see more variety in Harry's overall movement, like allow for more experimentation and exploration. Silent Hill 2 Remake did something similar, such as giving James a dedicated dodge button, but this was more so for combat encounters. Not to say, the player can use this for experimentation, such as dodging past a plethora of enemies to negate potential damage, or for the sake of preserving inertia and movement when traversing the streets of Silent Hill. But what was disappointing is not seeing the more attentive details, much like the original, where running side to side, hopping backwards, or even stumbling backwards is an option that can be utilized during gameplay. I think giving incentive to the player to experiment with their overall momentum during exploration throughout Silent Hill will allow for accessibility to one's playthrough, to see how they want to engage with their environment. Combat is of course a point of contention that has been marginally changed throughout the subsequent entries, even predating Silent Hill 2 Remake, that has had its fair share of discourse. Combat was introduced as a simple tool that was at Harry's disposal that is preconceived with this notion that encounters of enemies will be a staple in his journey, and the expectation for the player, given the fact that this is for 1, a survival horror game, and 2, the amount of optimization the game gives you, given the weapons found throughout the story. Harry is gradually introduced to each weapon at intervals that are important to not only signifying the type of weaponry, such as firearms or melee weapons, but visual cues to give the player the idea of what type of weapons are at their disposal to work with when it comes to combat. The handgun is the first weapon that he receives from Sybil Bennett that is simple in nature. He simply aims and fires handgun rounds at monsters that deal damage, which is best preserved for more of the common enemies throughout the game. But later on, this only benefits Harry for so long as he eventually comes to find the harder enemies with larger health and damage buffs that are aggressive and dangerous than the former. Because of this, it signifies to the player that each weapon will have its use and purpose that will have its benefits when used correctly on said enemy. The shotgun doing the best damage in close range on the harder enemies with the risk of close proximity to being susceptible to their attacks, while the hunting rifle gives the best damage output on the bosses that are tougher but also agile in nature, such as the Foot Stinger or Incubus, who are farther out of reach for Harry to have the best line of fire, which can prove to be difficult. Melee weapons are the second option as Harry's alternative when firearms aren't appropriate for the situation. The steel pipe is his introduction to melee combat and leaves a fantastic impression with how powerful it is when dealing damage to a monster, providing different actions such as a rapid swing in quick succession with lesser damage, or a downward swing that leaves a heavy blow that deals more of an impact. Much like the firearms, each melee weapon will serve its use, but will only provide so much substance for a period of time. However, the predisposition of this knowledge isn't limited to the player with feeling restraint, but if anything, allows for far much versatility. Regardless whether the weapon will be the best option or not, it's the overall thought process to that build-up that leaves a profound impression. One thing I think would be beneficial with both firearms and melee weapons for the remake is to expand upon the weapons by giving more incentive to experiment with Harry's overall combat. Harry doesn't necessarily need to go full hack and slash, but the player needs to remember a series of complex button inputs to deal combos, or suddenly have the intuition of a marksman expert on said enemies. That would only be counterintuitive to the already streamlined combat that is serviceable with its simplicity. Rather, giving both firearms and melee weapons nuance of this notion of allowing for that experimentation with visual and audio cues could give attention to detail and allowing the player to know what would be the best option for the situation. One thing that I love about the original is how the game highlights subtle details that are sprinkled into its overall design philosophy, which is translated into combat. Whether a firearm or melee weapon, depending on how the player uses it, that expresses the quality of its use when countering a monster. A light melee attack gives a weak yet efficient audio cue that signifies damage being dealt with some restraint in his attack, but a heavy melee attack gives a loud audio cue to reinforce the powerful nature of said melee attack. Having the monster counter this, depending on their response to Harry's attack, would signify the damage dealt by him, letting the player know the effectiveness of their impact. This would give incentive to allow experimentation at the player's disposal on how they want to approach each encounter, without feeling restricted and allowing themselves to know how to proceed forward with a more optimal route. Furthermore, gunplay can also be factored into this with Harry using weapons to the best of his ability, while staying cautious yet calculated with the use of firearms. A good example of this is the split-head boss fight. If the player were to go into this boss with a handgun, it will get the job done. However, it will drag on due to the damage output. If Harry spent time navigating Midwich Elementary School with curiosity, this will reward him the shotgun, which receives far more damage output compared to the handgun. Using the shotgun on the split head would see the reward of the player's exploration by expressing the effectiveness of the far better output of the damage dealt by the shotgun. While this is great, it would be interesting to see this translated to the player with how the monster reacts to said weapon. If the monster receives little to no impact to a firearm with less output, the reaction would be minimal. But if they were to receive damage from a weapon with higher output, the reaction would not only be more vocal, but also become more defensive, such as reacting with dodging Harry's attack or countering with a parry. This is, of course, dependent on the enemy, as I imagine having each enemy do this would be more tedious than good. But it's little details like this that are subtle, that give nuance to distinguish not only how combat can factor into gameplay, but also how the enemy AI would correspond with the player's experimentation, which would give incentive to replay with a new approach. On the topic of gameplay, exploration is a standard that is seen within each Silent Hill game. It is precedent as you are a lonely soul wandering aimlessly in a town without anyone or anything, at least that is human, leaving you to help yourself, wondering where to go, what is going on, and what you should do. But in understanding this, it gives the player the free will to explore this atmosphere at their disposal. By far, one of my favorite pastimes is simply exploring the town of Silent Hill. It expresses this dark, decrepit atmosphere in moments where it wants to create immersion of tension, such as encountering a monster that can be noticed with a sound heard elsewhere from Harry's position, allowing you time to proceed with caution. But there are also times where the sound can completely mess with the player without any given notice, such as the use of loud audible sound that is abrupt to amplify the horror to make you question if there's potentially danger nearby, as it could be anything or nothing. To then transition from the foggy, lonely streets of Silent Hill that are quiet in its ambience, which is mysterious yet foreboding, knowing that there's this looming dread around the corner, to then suddenly an ominous, oppressive atmosphere without any preconceived notion with a sudden change in scenery, where the environment is suddenly pitch black that obscures your path in this darkness. However, there are also times where exploring the town comes with this uncanny sense of comfort that feels contradictory to the horror in its design, which feels wrong, but at the same time feels so right. There is a reason why Masahiro Ito refers to Silent Hill as a state of mind, because for me, Silent Hill is the parallel space found between reality and unreality, that I find myself wandering aimlessly and resting in this relaxation that feels like my safe space and home to me. It doesn't tell this to you, but if anything, expresses this to you through the wonderfully crafted visuals and its imagery, which is complemented with a sound in its ambience that is one of pure melancholy, reminding you of a time in life that was more simple and carefree. This is a sentiment I sincerely hope is also expressed likewise in Silent Hill 1 Remake, as this would be greatly benefited with not only attributing to that familial environment in the original, but cement that feeling with the benefit of a modern graphical engine that gives more of that immersion, with envisioning what the developers imagining wanting to create back in the day, but were restrained due to the limitations of older hardware, but now is a reality with such technology. Exploring the pseudonymous town in the remake has the potential to expand upon familiar areas such as Old Silent Hill, Central Silent Hill, and Silent Hill Resort area, accessing previously unexplored areas to allow not only options, but also incentive to expand upon the lore of memos to uncover, interactions with small details in the environment which can be commented on by Harry, or rewarding the player with exploration to previously thought mundane areas, which happen to be actually productive of the player's time, rewarding the player with items that could be beneficial in their journey. While exploration would be expanded, I wouldn't want it to be too open-ended, as this would be counterintuitive to the more claustrophobic atmosphere that is seen as tense and oppressive in the more linear and maze-like design of the Otherworld. This would diminish that immersion that is translated in the original, which is not only found in its design, but also throughout the gameplay, which is expressed through the monsters littered throughout the halls and rooms, locked doors that forces the player to rethink their navigation, or having to be particularly cautious when it comes to encountering an enemy, as sound can be played against you, alerting monsters nearby of your current location. To build upon this, giving more detail on its quality of this aforementioned atmosphere in the exploration design would be much more immersive by keeping the fundamentals simple and not change what is already perfect. Rather, changing up the typical layout in its design would demand the player to rethink what was previously known with this prior background knowledge of the original, and think carefully on how to tread lightly in the remake, such as remixing item locations, adding more difficulty to the puzzle designs, or giving monster variations that change the monster's mannerisms and behavior to give that unpredictability. While this would bring about change, the important takeaway here is that the visuals and the environment would stay the same, giving consistency to its style, without having to pivot away from its identity. But it's in this change to the gameplay that could complement the original by giving incentive to experiment with the design, whilst also staying true to the formula. The story of Silent Hill 1, to put it simply, is otherworldly. It's a story that is like no other, that leaves an everlasting impression on you. On a surface level, the plot is quite straightforward. A widowed man finds himself in a mysterious town that is searching for his lost daughter, who finds unfathomable horrors that await him with an ensemble cast of characters that, much like him, are only trying to understand and piece together what exactly is going on in the town of Silent Hill. Harry Mason is without a doubt served as the heroic archetype character that is solely made for the purpose of not only giving a motivation and driving the story forward, but also made to relate to him due to his character adopting the everyday man trope. Much of his character, at initial glance, can be interpreted as a surface-level character without much to him. However, I disagree and argue that Harry Mason is a multifaceted character in his own right, but, much like the idea of Silent Hill, has many layers that need to be understood. The means of getting a better understanding of Harry is through his memos he leaves Heather while experiencing her story in Silent Hill 3. In certain intervals throughout the game, Heather can find memos left by Harry which gives a more methodical approach that uniquely expands on his character's personality, by facilitating a character with internalized thoughts that are translated onto paper as a means of communication. This complements the fact that he's a novelist in his career pursuits. It's also a neat little callback to seeing his internalized thoughts manifested when first saving at the save point in Cafe 5-2, which is a literal and figurative demonstration of the player seeing not only their in-game progress saved, but also Harry, figuratively speaking, saving his progress by writing his notes down of his experience in Silent Hill. In Harry providing these writings to Heather, it also allows for the writers to give Harry more substance with the moral complexity conveyed to his character, such as struggling with his intrusive thoughts and fears that are provoked with the prior knowledge of knowing that Heather's a reincarnation of both Cheryl and Alessa, whom are tied to divine and unholy power that is corrupted by the cults, the Order, and manipulating Alessa against her own will to orchestrate the birth of a false god. And in knowing the damage that was done, it scares him to see what the outcome can unfold with the rebirth of Cheryl, now going as Heather. It rightfully creates this fear that is ingrained into Harry to have to rationalize his thoughts over the moral complex decision of killing an innocent child that has done nothing wrong, but also having to live with the trauma and tragedy of both Cheryl and Alessa's past telling him otherwise. But ultimately, it's his loving care he chooses over and believing to give Heather the life she truly deserves. That cements his character, and that at his core, he's a loving father that wants nothing but the best life for those he loves. It's these little attention to details that I would love to see expanded upon in the remake, with Harry expressing his internalized thoughts whenever he saves on a notepad, which gives a much more nuanced approach to his character. Of course, this doesn't have to be limited to just the save points, but even through his interactions with items, the environment, encounters with the otherworld, and the monsters that he comes to find. It'd create a great sense of immersion and highlight the basis of his character, as someone who's very provocative of such thoughts derived from his subconscious that tells more about him. This notion of showing and not telling the player when it comes to subtle storytelling can also be applied to the likes of Michael Kaufman or Dahlia Gillespie. Mysterious in nature, but give the impression there are hints of anonymity in their character. Dahlia is portrayed as a crazed religious fanatic that speaks in cryptic speech that is, at initial glance, meant to express a character not taken seriously, but I'd argue that's the point. One can find her aloofness to be to her benefit to build up to the climax of facilitating her more devious nature and wanting to use Harry as her proxy, by manipulating him into believing Alessa is being possessed by a demon who wants to cause destruction to the town of Silent Hill, as her red herring. It's unfathomable how evil Dahlia truly is by using her own daughter to manipulate and orchestrate her master plan. This can, however, be disparaged due to her voice acting portraying a different impression, which might express a hint of goofiness to her speech and line delivery. Improving upon little things like this and in the original with the remake would only reinforce her character's devious nature without losing the hint of uncanniness seen through her personality and behavior. Michael Kaufman, at a surface level, is seen as a side character that is loosely mentioned as a cohort associated with Dahlia, but at the last second before she is brutally murdered by the incubus. Other than this knowledge, he is merely a businessman who works as the director at Alchemilla Hospital at face value, but one with a short temper and a hint of callousness, such as undergoing a side quest and confronting him about the Aglophidus. However, much more would be expressed to his character with reading the various memos detailing the legal practices condoned under Kaufman and his associate, Norman Young, who both run a legal drug market that is secretly distributed through Alchemilla Hospital as a cover, in order to elicit these drugs to the tourists of Silent Hill for a mere profit. Capitalizing on the sub-story to be rooted to the overarching plot would only reinforce that connection Kaufman and Dahlia have to the bigger picture, without having to shamelessly undergo an exposition dump by the characters, and trying to understand the story beats that is lazily told to the player to gain this understanding. It undervalues the subtlety in its storytelling that is expressed in the various memos to uniquely tell that story. The remake can improve upon this exponentially by building upon Kaufman's legal practices and how this is connected to the Order's funding to stay relevant as a cult that has not only connections, but a deeply rooted corruption that controls much of the town to convey the cult's power and influence. Lisa Garland, much like Alessa Gillespie, is a tragic character. Her story is loosely explored through the conversations you have with her upon subsequent visits Harry has with Lisa in Alchemilla Hospital. Much of the information disclosed by her is left intentionally ambiguous due to her amnesia, as she is incapable of remembering her past and likewise what exactly is going on. This is slowly built up over time with unveiling her overall purpose and how she is connected to the Order and Alessa, which is hinted at with Lisa making it abundantly clear that she's forced to reside at Alchemilla Hospital for a reason. That reason is seen at the climax of her story, with her revealing to Harry that she is a manifestation of Alessa's nightmarish delusions that is projected from her memories she experienced with her, whilst Lisa was Alessa's caretaker before her death. This is of course not made clear to the player and is left ambiguous as to how she was killed, but it's the implications that leave this emotional impact on the player by reading her journal she leaves Harry after she disappears. This documents her experience of being addicted to a drug called PTV through blackmail under Michael Kaufman to ensure Alessa's death is covered up. The substance abuse of this drug provoked delusions and hallucinations that were nonsensical but a reality for her, as well as undergoing the trauma of having to forcefully be a caretaker under Alessa, which is made even more tragic considering Alessa looked to Lisa for her only source of comfort, yet Lisa saw Alessa as a liability that she feared. This is greatly explored in the digital comic Silent Hill: Keijo Cradle, illustrated by Masahiro Ito and written by Hideyoki Owaku. The digital comic was released only in Japan, but is considered partially lost media, due to Ito being legally unable to release any official material due to a contract with Konami. In the comic, it's a prequel that explores Lisa's backstory and her relationship with Alessa. This supplements more detail that adds more depth to both characters that solidifies the tragedy that is their relationship, which falls apart, due to Lisa blaming Alessa for her boyfriend's death, in which she simultaneously dies at the hands of Altiel, becoming manifested into the otherworld as one of Alessa's memories, having material that is either lost media or supplementary as a companion piece, much like the aforementioned Keijo Cradle, that would give more substance to these characters that can be explored in the remake. This could be framed through the CRT TV that Harry finds in Nowhere, which he uses if he finds the VHS tape. In the short VHS tape, it shows Lisa's thoughts and fears of trying to comprehend Alessa's ability to survive her mutilated burns and scars after the ritual conducted by her mother, Dahlia. This can be repurposed to explore more of these flashbacks, as it only complement that unique feature through these VHS tapes found within the game that explores Lisa's backstory and relationship with these characters. Speaking of Alessa, she is arguably the core of the story that's connected to each respective character, as she is, metaphorically speaking, the vessel. That not only is a driving force in each character's motivation to exact their individual desires, but in many ways, the vessel that keeps Silent Hill alive. The story makes it clear that Alessa is a sympathetic character, and this is seen through her scattered memories that are projected through her inner psyche, manifested in this haunting reality. This is most notable through the fog world, otherworld, monsters, and the memories that are closely associated with her upbringing that show that slow burn over time. This is uniquely framed in-game with places Harry visits throughout the story, such as Midwich Elementary School, with allegories to bullying with subtle imagery, or children's antics and laughter and childish behavior through the representation of the Grey Child. Alchemilla projects the illness and decline of Alessa's deteriorating health that is manifested through the decrepit, rot seen in the interiors of the Otherworld version, symbolic of her mutilated burns and scars through the ritual that resulted in her being handicapped and confined to the hospital basement for 7 long years, while the subtle storytelling that is visualized through the seal of Metatrons located throughout the subsequent places in Silent Hill, that are orchestrated as a plot by Alessa in an attempt to commit annihilation of the town to seek out her death in an act of suicide to finally put an end to her pain and suffering. This emphasis of Alessa's pain and suffering is uniquely translated to the player to truly solidify her as not only a sympathetic character, but one that is utterly tragic, to instill that hopelessness she represents from her birth to her death. It's in this subtlety that needs to be translated into the remake and not be touched upon as it uses allegories and visual imagery to express this notion, to express the tragedy of her character. The remake shouldn't have to change any of this, and instead, heavily double down on not having to result in exposition dumping. Much like the final act, where Dahlia has to explain this to the player to paint the picture of how evil she is through her actions and manipulating and subjecting her child to conceiving the birth of a god through her pain and suffering. This is directly shown to the player through her memories in the lens of Harry Mason, which hints enough curiosity to give enough trust in the player to connect the dots to work out and understand her character. Like the old saying goes, don't fix something that isn't broken. If anything, expanding upon that subtle storytelling through visual iconography can help allude to the notion of her character that can be built upon without restraints and graphical limitations, and instead, artistically express that through a photorealistic modern lens to paint that picture. I hope these thoughts of mine opened up room for discussion and speculation of what can be improved upon in Silent Hill 1 Remake. I imagine there was much that I missed and didn't touch upon, but these are of course merely thoughts that could be greatly expanded upon. If anything, thoughts and ideas I wanted to experiment and fluctuate with to give incentive on how the remake could be improved or not. At the end of the day, Silent Hill 1 is, to me, a perfect game, regardless of the archaic gameplay compared to its modern contemporaries after it. It truly is a technical marvel and a unique piece of storytelling framed in this medium that I've never seen done before, especially in a survival horror game before it and even after it. It's of course an artistic expression that is painted through the lens of a video game, and it is hauntingly beautiful in going about expressing that survival horror in its story, gameplay, sound, design, and overall presentation that will always be found in the original. It's why I want to express that sentiment so the remake can attribute to those thoughts and feelings I imagine I don't only hold, but many others who grew up with this game, likewise share alongside me. I will always value and appreciate an artist's original work, especially one that is sought out through endeavors that are limited through restrictions and using unique and creative means of storytelling to express their passions and interests to tell that story they feel that is needed to be told. I'm in the minority that think remakes can offer incentive to express that notion of retelling that original work, but through complementing the artist's original efforts, by expanding upon those ideas to express one's appreciation on the medium without disparaging their work and instead respecting it, by making changes that are what the original artist would make if they had the tools at their disposal and weren't restricted at the time. Ironically, it's these restrictions in experiencing Silent Hill, especially through the lack of preservation, to give all the more reason to experience this beloved classic. It's important now more than ever, as it's virtually impossible without spending a down payment on original hardware along with a retail copy. While there is emulation, this could be off-putting to the casual person who merely wants an official storefront where they can install the game digitally. As much as I would love to imagine official port or enhanced remaster through Konami, entrusting their blessing with a developer who delves into that technical field of study, I unfortunately don't see that happening anytime soon. As I imagine moving forward, at least from a business decision, remakes are the priority, due to the format's financial success and popularity. It's not to say that this necessarily replaces the original, but serves as an alternative to emulate that experience, due to lack of negligence in acquiring the original source code for developers to work with to make the original Silent Hill properly preserved. While it is a shame that the original will most likely never be preserved, at least not officially, there is, as of recently, the drive in advocating for finally getting the original Silent Hill properly preserved by the fans, given the recent efforts by individual developers on GitHub, decompiling the source code in hopes of any developer to run the code on an open source engine, which only reinstates the idea of an actual unofficial port through this hard work and effort in making this possible, and that is a long-term goal that I hope is accomplished one day. Whether a remake is a good or a bad thing is subjective enough for the player to decide. For now, we won't truly know until we finally get our hands on the remake to make that decision for ourselves. I, for one, however, am thoroughly looking forward to the remake, as I truly believe there is potential here that can be built upon while appreciating and respecting the original's work. But until then, we will have to wait and see. As always, thank you for watching, please have a great day, stay safe, and goodbye.